Greetings and welcome to the recombobulation area. My name is Dan Schaefer. Thank you for joining us. Donald Trump was sworn into office as the 47th president this week, and with that inauguration came a flurry of activity, perhaps most notably on the issue of immigration. One report this week said Donald Trump characterized immigration as his number one issue in his 2024 campaign, ahead of even the economy. So today, we want to talk about immigration. But part of having this conversation means separating some of the rhetoric from the reality and talk about what is actually happening on this issue. Because on balance, this can all be pretty discombobulating. So joining us today to help recombobulate and make sense of the issues are our guests for this episode, Gabriela Parra and Kevin Layde, managing partners at the Layde Parra law firm. And joining me as co-host today is Angela Lang, executive director of Black Leaders Organizing for Communities. Gabriela, Kevin, and Angela, thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to the recombobulation area.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So before we jump into it here, I have to let our listeners know something, and that is that Kevin and I are very good friends. And so in order to make sure, part of the reason I wanted to have Gabriela and Angela here was first and foremost for their insight on this issue and for their thoughts today on the podcast, but also to be some adults in the room, because Kevin and I will go on a tangent and end up talking about Milwaukee Bucks trades from the early 2000s or having our millionth argument about which decade has better music. So it's really important that you guys are here so that we're not subjecting our listeners to Kevin's terrible takes on sports and pop culture.
I would like to be invited back to talk about both of those things at some point.
I would like to hear that, actually, especially the music one.
Maybe we'll save that for the very, very end of the podcast and just cut Kevin off in time. So anyway, good to have some adults in the room to put some guardrails on our conversation here. So obviously, this has been a pretty discombobulating week when it comes to the issue of immigration and with Donald Trump and the flurry of activity that he has taken on this issue. And I want to talk about that. But before I want to get into, just the specifics of the last week and some of the details of what Donald Trump has been doing, I want to zoom out a little bit and kind of walk through a timeline of how we got here. So when Donald Trump, let's start from when Donald Trump first took office in 2017 and the changes that he made then, and then we can walk through to what changed in the Biden presidency, and then what Trump is trying to change or do differently now. So first, what did Donald Trump do first time around when he became president in 2017?
I feel like it almost makes sense to zoom back even slightly further than that. I think that more so than a lot of other areas in life, immigration policy is something that's kind of developed in real time, like administration by administration, and there's some broad trends I think that have started to show themselves over the course of just the last 20 years. So if you look at it, Barack Obama, I think, was the George W. Bush administration had some increase in enforcement for sure from previous administrations, and I think Obama really ramped it up to another level, particularly at the border. And I think that showed kind of the American people had this, at least a tolerance or a desire for the system to really be punitive in a sense, right? Focused on punishment, focused on expelling people from the country as the way people think about and interact with immigration, kind of in their lives, the way they think about it. And I think the Trump administration really was just a continuation of a lot of the things that the Obama administration put into place. Some of the biggest changes, I think, the way I would describe it is unpredictability, because the president has so much power over the immigration system. Certainly some things, can be changed by Congress, but the president's in charge of enforcement of the immigration laws, which means they can tell the immigration police, who to stop, when and why, how to hold those people, all those sorts of things. And I think the Trump administration really leaned into that in a big way, in viewing themselves as a detention first and using law enforcement to resolve these types of issues. And then from my perspective, the Biden administration tried to ramp that. I would say that they stopped the pace of the change in the Trump administration, really, and they didn't put a lot of new policies like that, but they didn't do a lot of stuff to roll it back either. I would look at more as treading water in a lot of ways, which is why it's kind of scary, because I think a lot of the structures are in place for Trump coming in now in some sense to be able to kind of pick up where he left off. I don't know, Gabby, what do you think about that as a take?
Yeah, I think the only couple things I would add is that just the hatefulness towards the immigrant community through a leader has been very difficult to witness. I mean, both my parents are immigrants from Mexico. I'm surrounded by the immigrant community day in and day out. So, I have heard the rhetoric or the policies from George Bush, then later on Obama, then later on we have Trump, but just the way that he portrays the immigrant community as rapists, as, criminals, that's, I think, taken it to a very different level. The Biden came back and he was also enforcing, he's, bad in some policies, and we'll get to those, but he is enforcing these policies at a different level and at least with some respect. The other big change that I felt was the attack in the interior towards like immigrants that have been here for 10, 20, 30 years, that have dedicated their whole life of building the United States. And just Trump has not acknowledged any of that or try to figure any solutions to try to get people that have been here paying taxes for so long, contributing to this country's growth in e-commerce and agriculture. Just not acknowledging any of that and just being everyone is an enforcement, regardless of how long you've been in this country, has just been very different than what I've experienced and witnessed before.
So when Trump talks about now, it's like when I was president last time, we were tough on the border. We had a strong border, blah, blah, blah. What policies really did he implement there at that time? And what did, and are those things that Biden immediately removed when he became president in 2021?
Yeah, I can start the conversation, Kevin. So a couple of things that really were frightening that he implemented. A big one that everybody hopefully recalls was separating parents from children at the border. And so that was a big one that I just had never expected our country would ever do that and put kids in a foster care system. That was a big one. The other big one he implemented at the border was charging individuals federally criminal when they were coming into the country. And also the issuance or the expansion of the expedited removal, which means that if you're coming into the country, if you're have been here less than 14 days or 100 miles from, less than 2 years or 100 miles from the border, he can issue an expedited removal without you having the right to see a judge. And that was another big one that he implemented. And the one, a last one I will touch on is the stay in Mexico to file your asylum claim, but the courts are in the US. And somehow our, asylum seekers had to figure out when their court was in the US and be allowed to come in from Mexico into the border towns, typically with the immigration courts in the border towns, come to their hearing and then go back to Mexico. And out of that, a lot of people didn't get the right to hear their claim because they didn't know when to go to their court hearing, and a lot of them were issued removed without due process.
Yeah, I feel like the remain in Mexico policy has been kind of one that's been in the news, was something that Trump implemented. And then what exactly did Biden do on that issue? And how did that have an impact on the border, on people seeking to come here?
So the Biden administration did rescind the remain in Mexico policy shortly after he took office. And essentially, the enforcement at the border in the Biden administration has been such a weird 4 years because you had COVID at the beginning. And so a big thing that they were doing was what they call a Title 42 exception. So just to back it up, the whole thing is the USA signs these agreements, these international agreements for to have humanitarian protections for people who are seeking danger, right? And then we have to implement those protections into our legal system, right? It's like the UN, all these ideas. So we have all of these very strong laws that were made after World War II that give people these entitlements to be able to hey, if I'm going to get killed, you can't send me back to my home country, right? And so what I feel like this whole project has been is trying to peel back the strength of that And what Stephen Miller, who was a big policy guy in Trump the first time and will be this time, he said he's trying to set up a series of unsolvable dilemmas, right? And where it's like you can't keep everybody out all the time through the legal process, but you can make it so 80% of the people no longer qualify. And then after that, there's another hurdle they have to pass. And then after that, there's another hurdle they have to pass. And some of them are logistic, like Gabby was saying. You're living in a border town, which is super dangerous. You might be homeless, right, on the Mexican side, and you have to come back at 4 a.m. to a bridge to go across to go talk to a judge who's going to see 1,000 other people that day and is like predisposed to not like you, and then, right. And that's just one thing, right? And then there's a million different things that go on after that. So like what the Biden administration did was to continue some of those things. And I think the big one was this Title 42 thing, which was declaring a public health emergency as a way to defer some of those humanitarian obligations, and took away some of the other ones, like the Remain in Mexico and the family separation. Trump stopped doing the family separation stuff towards the end, but right. And I think a lot of it was like optics, as well, like what looks bad. But I think if you look at the numbers, under Biden, they're like going down. And the reason they're going down, it's not like less people want to come here. I mean, he has put in a bunch of very, like even beyond, once you get across the border and you're actually presenting an asylum case, they are putting in all these little procedural things to make the cases harder to win. They're like predisposing really cases against people from some countries based on like political things and all sorts of other stuff, right? So it is like you're trying to like throw a dart through a pinhole, basically, when you want to go through one of these cases. But there's so many people coming in that there are people who are still going to qualify, right? And now you feel like with Trump, it's like they're going to keep pushing until they can reduce that number down to as tiny as possible. So that's kind of the big way I see the border enforcement fitting into the whole thing.
So what would be the best way to characterize Biden's approach to the border? Because the conservatives always talk about, Republicans always talk about just, okay, this is open borders, right? And so we're going to close the border, we're going to do this, but that's just like a very simple rhetorical argument. So what's the reality of what exactly is happening here? Because, and I try to follow this stuff, and again, it's complicated, it's discombobulating, all that. It just seems like Biden and the Democrats have not had a very coherent vision for what they've wanted there. It seems like they just kind of bounce from thing to thing. Is that a fair way to characterize it, or is there something else going on there?
I think there is a couple of things that in terms of Biden that was implemented to try to limit the amount of people that showed up at the border unlawfully, right? So we had, the being able to get parole from 4 countries, which typically these 4 countries, people are fleeing from their government because they're fearing persecution, which is Venezuela, Cuba, Haiti, and Nicaragua, right? So he implemented a parole program being, look, don't cross all these different countries undocumented. We want to first process you, fingerprint you, do all those background checks, and then make sure that we're allowed to bring you in, right? And so that was a good program that I think in practice, it was harder because it was 30,000 only. There was more applicants that, than they would issue. They would randomly select 15,000, and then they would do 15,000 first come, first serve. So it was still, they had its issues, but at least it controlled who was coming into the United States. The other big program, which, has its issues as well, but it was through CBP1, where you would, do an appointment so that you make sure.
Is this that app that has been in the news this week? Yeah. Okay.
So you would do an appointment, and so CBP officers would be prepared to process you instead of whole caravan coming in and everyone not knowing what to do with 5,000 people showing up. And so it was, people were waiting for their appointment, and then when they were given their appointment, they were showing up at the border, and CBP officers were prepared to process them, to ask for asylum. And so there's some things that I think they were trying to make sure that people that were coming in were screened, instead of like everyone showing up and there's no protection at the border in terms of processing people. So I think those were all good programs that have ended first day that Trump took office.
Yeah, I feel like it was like 2 things. I mean, 3 things. The number one thing is to try not to talk about it publicly at all as much as possible, because they viewed it as a losing issue that they had to run away from. I know I'm not here to weigh in on politics, but that's really the way I see it. The other thing is there are two things where they wanted to create additional lawful pathways that didn't exist to have a more, as Gabby was saying, controlled and orderly process for people who were going to come in presumably undocumented otherwise, so it's like don't pay the smuggler, do it this way, and then it's like kind of a win-win, right? You can come in and present your asylum claim. But the other thing you tried to do was to kind of rescind, like to disincentivize other types of stuff, like unlawful crossings. Like I was talking about, like he put in a bunch of new rules where it's like if people came in after a certain day, just jumping across the border or whatever, then like they can't really do their asylum claims anymore for the most part. It's just shut the door on them, right? So they're really trying like a push and pull thing. And like I kind of get it. You know what I mean? Like I kind of see what they're trying to do in terms of having both a carrot and a stick. But the problem is it's half measures. It's not a systemic thing that really makes an impact that changes people's behavior. And it's like Gabby's saying, 30,000 people. How many people want to come into the United States? They're apprehending like 200,000 people at the border a month for a while, a couple of years ago. So like that's just not going to satisfy it. So then what happens is, then only the rich people get to do it, or like the smugglers figure out a way that they can like make money off of it. And then the whole thing just kind of spirals down. And of course, the public doesn't know about this and they don't really care either, right? So there's no popular support for this type of stuff. And now it's just gone. And like what could have been a good idea is just a classic example. What could have been a good idea is just, it's like it was never even here now. So we're back to square one.
Great.
Fun.
Oh, we haven't even gotten close to the depressing stuff yet.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
We haven't talked about that. Angela, did you have thoughts on the really optimistic stuff that Kevin was talking
I know. I was
about
like
there?
writing. I was like, there's so many things. I know we're gonna get into this in a bit, but like my brain goes a lot to locally and whatnot, and some of the rhetoric, right? Because I feel that while we're on the topic, Democrats, if they would have actually stood up and actually had a plan years in advance, maybe we wouldn't be here right now. And this is what happens when Democrats are inactive, right? Like, if you are, silent and passive, you are complicit and you're actively propping up an institution and a structure that is actually harming people. And as many times as I've seen friends, colleagues, organizers, loved ones really try to sound that alarm, it's been really disheartening to know that Democrats, and this is one of many issues, kind of put that on the back burner for the sake of trying to win. And guess what? They're not even winning. So that, while we're on the topic of Democrats, but it's interesting because I think that there's a lot of fear. I've talked to a lot of folks and people feel scared. And also at the same time, people are like, well, what is the status? There's lawsuits. Yes, people are preparing, and I'm glad that there's a lot of like know your rights trainings because you have to be prepared now. And I know meetings are happening over the weekend, but also at the same time, it's just like we can't keep, holding on to this and watching every second. I think for the sake of all of our wellness and mental health and loved ones and friends. So it's like, what is this balance of like preparing, but then also not preemptively spiraling and understanding where we are, but that there's legal challenges as well.
Yeah. I mean, I can get us started on that conversation. And, the biggest thing that happens is the fear that the community has because they don't understand the system and how it plays out, right? The president can sign as many executive orders as he wants, but that doesn't mean those are all going to get implemented. And the big thing with this administration is putting fear to an immigrant community that's already vulnerable and doesn't understand the American court system. And so here you are in a situation where, Kevin and I and our whole team at Layde Parra had to spend countless hours this week just reassuring clients that they needed to stay calm and that they needed to wait. People were already saying like, there's raids over here, there's raids over here. And I'm like, there is no raids yet, especially. So it's like, I think the biggest thing with a community we're dealing with is that they don't understand our court system, and they're afraid. They're afraid of like what's saying in the news, and sometimes the news articles don't know how to report on the immigration or what's going on, right? So the biggest thing, I did a video earlier to my immigrant community, and the biggest thing I said, y'all gotta calm down. I know this is tough. But if we're all panicking 24/7, then it makes, that makes everyone's job harder, right? The advocates that are fighting, and so the kids that they have in their home, right? And so it's like we need to calm down, and we need to understand that it has to go through a legal process. And you have some amazing advocates and litigators that have been preparing for Trump since he took office. I mean, the ACLU dropped their lawsuit right away. The states drop their lawsuits. So it's like, I tell clients, just calm down. If there is something you need to panic about, I will be the first one to blast it everywhere so that you know that you need to be worried about this. But in the meantime, we need to understand that these people want to scare you so that you willingly just leave the country or remain in hiding, and you cannot allow that to happen. So right now, just make sure that whatever you're watching knows or understands immigration law, and follow those immigration attorneys or news outlets that really know how to report on this issue, and stay calm.
Well, I'm gonna have to send every article I get about the Trump administration to you first, so that you can tell me whether or not I should panic about it.
Yeah, seriously.
So let's just unpack some of the things that have happened over the past week here. So Donald Trump is sworn in on Monday. He makes a number of executive actions on the topic of immigration. I think probably the headline issue for all of that is his going after birthright citizenship, which to me seems blatantly unconstitutional, blatantly violating the 14th Amendment. What exactly is he trying to do here? And I think there was, some news at the local level and in lower courts. Tony Evers and Josh Call joined a lawsuit with a number of states challenging this. And I think there was a Reagan-appointed judge in Washington State, I want to say, correct me if I'm wrong, who put a hold on this order. So just help me make sense of what exactly this headline issue on birthright citizenship. What are they trying to do, and what do you expect to unfold here in the coming days and weeks?
Yeah. It's funny. I remember on election night right towards the end of Trump's first term is when they started talking about birthright citizenship. It's like they'd been in office, they were starting to work on all this stuff. And it kind of felt like, to me, that's sort of the ultimate end goal fantasy for people whose number one goal is to restrict immigration. And to see them come out of the gate and try to attempt it in the way they're doing it really tells you a lot, I think, about what this administration's goals are actually going to be for trying to do a lot of this stuff. And I think what the order said is that in 30 days, so it's going to be like February 19th or something like that, they're going to order that they stop issuing Social Security numbers and U.S. passports to children of people who are undocumented, and also people who are here on like temporary visas and things like that, like tourist visas or work visas or things like that. And so
children born in this country, to be clear.
Born in this country, right? And of course, America, actually one of the few countries in the world that has birthright citizenship, which is just you're born on the soil and you're automatically a United States citizen. So, what we're talking about here is creating an entire class of people that are born in the United States as undocumented people. They're born in the United States without the ability to work legally, without the ability to travel, without the ability to get federal student loans, without the ability to get driver's licenses effective immediately. I don't have a sense of what the numbers would be for this, but you're talking, I'm sure we have an all-time high undocumented population in this country. You're talking about immediately creating a new class of American. A type of American that has never existed before, an American who is born in this country without rights. And that is very, very, very hard for me to really wrap my mind around and understand, even what the implications like short, medium, long term are. But it just feels like it would be a shift into a different country to me. And I honestly don't think I'm overstating it.
So, okay, I'm glad you brought up like the 14th Amendment, because this is really just the space that I've been sitting in literally since Trump got reelected. And understanding that the 14th Amendment touches a lot of things. It touches a lot of communities. And I'm not the only one, but some folks are thinking, okay, understanding the 14th Amendment, Reconstruction, enslaved folks, their children are now citizens. Some people are thinking they're coming after, people think immigration, people's immediate thought is Mexicans, the Mexican border. We're not talking about immigrants from Canada. We're not talking about that, right? And so people are starting to think, if they can do this to folks from Mexico and Mexican immigrants, what other communities could they be potentially trying to come after next? Am I overly paranoid for that analysis?
No, I did not make that connection, man, with the 14th Amendment. And because I was totally wrong when I said this is a new type of American. It's not. There was a group of people in America before who were born without rights. And that is just blowing my mind actually right now. I'm putting that together. I'm sorry, Gabby, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, Angela, wow, maybe, right? You don't know with this administration what their real plans are, but I will say this, let's remember that immigration is also a Black issue. We have a lot of Black immigrants, especially I think I've seen it a lot more in the last few years with the increase of Haitians, with the increase of, we have a lot of Afro Latinos as well. So I think that it needs to be also seen as an issue from different communities. I know typically people say, Mexican or Latin America, but again, we have high numbers of immigration coming from other African countries, right? So it's a Black issue as well. One of the big things I think I would add to the reflection that Kevin said about birthright citizenship, I mean, as a, someone that grew up with immigrant parents, that has always been an issue. I've heard it since I was like a 9-year-old, my mom being like, they want to remove your citizenship. They want to remove your citizenship. So it's always been an issue. I think why, as I was reflecting on what a difference it is now, where the Latinos who were 9, 7, 8 years old, now we're of age. We're starting to be in positions of power. We're starting to grow. And so it's like now that we're starting to have our influence in elections, in the economy, you want to restrict this because half of the immigrants are from Latin America. So you want to start restricting this ability for Latinos to be able to be in these positions of power. And so it goes beyond just, all the violations and access that you won't be able to have, but it's also removing us from these spaces now that we're coming of age, where a lot of my fellow Latinos of my age are starting to be running for Congress, doing all these different things that it took a while for us to get there. So that's what I was reflecting as I was, they want to remove us from these positions. And so a good way to do that is if you don't have access to these spaces, that's another way to get rid of us, right? So that was another reflection as I was thinking about the passage of birthright citizenship.
Yeah,
that's a powerful point. Thank you.
The one thing I don't know is how likely do they think this is to succeed? Because it's obviously a huge tone setter. It's just like a shot across the bow. Because if they're going for that publicly already day one, nothing else is going to be more surprising than that to me, or can go further than this. And so obviously got stopped in day one in the courts, and it's going to take probably years now to go up and go through. And I'm just wondering if they think this is actually going to happen, or if they don't, And I honestly don't. I honestly don't know. I don't really have a prediction right now for what's going to happen.
And this, just to take a little bit of a political opinion on this one, then it just seems like when Republicans take office, Trump in particular, he's just going to do things and then see if it works, and then maybe and try to, instead of normally I would use the phrase to just do something and then ask for forgiveness, but Trump's not doing that either.
Right.
So, but and I think the opposite is the Democrats just waiting to, we need to hear back from the parliamentarian. This can't upset the norms and all of these different types of things. And just the opposite of that is we have Trump and Republicans trying to bulldoze the Constitution on day one of his second term. So beyond that, which obviously immensely concerning, what are some of the other actions from the past few days that have stood out to you that could really have an impact on people living in Milwaukee, people living in Wisconsin?
Yeah, one of the biggest ones that I really sat back and I was like, no way, was his command to, well, there's a couple, but one was his command that ICE officers should make an effort to detain individuals that are already in court proceedings. That one, like, and that they should fight their case detained. So just to give you guys some background, typically when someone gets detained or if they're at the border, they eventually get released, whether on their own recognizances, whether they pay a bond, and then they just get to fight their case released. And, you know, for various reasons, that's the best way, right? Access to evidence, access to the client, your attorney.
The due process rights that
due
people are
process,
afforded.
right? The importance of being able to have all these different access that you wouldn't get if you were detained. And so one of the things that he instructed was that ICE agents should evaluate cases, and even if they have just pending cases without having violated their conditions, because they get conditions when they get released, right? Don't get into trouble, just like parole or when you're released on bond, don't get into trouble. So now they put do not work unlawfully. So like before they couldn't put that, but whatever. And so now it's like this idea that you have all these individuals that have been released waiting for their asylum claim or waiting to finish their case with an immigration judge who have not committed or violated any of their conditions. Now you have a president instructing the ICE officers to detain those individuals and force them to fight their case detained. So, you know, that on top of like all these other raids he wants them to do, plus like the lack of resources, the lack of bed space that actually exists. And so it's like that one was a little shocker for me when I was reviewing the different changes.
And these court cases take so long too, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's part of the thing that you know, Kevin has told me about a little bit. It's just that the backlog that exists in some of these cases. It's not like this is an expedited process or anything like that. So does this, you know, one of the things that we always hear about immigration is crime, which is another narrative that we could perhaps unpack. But like, if people are focusing their attention on this kind of like across the board type of action that you're discussing here, does that take away from their ability to actually focus on people who are engaging in criminal behavior?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does, right? Because if you don't have any bed space to put individuals, like you can't detain them. And so I think it's that. I think it's also like just the resources. We just don't have the resources. Right now we only have one detained judge, and in that serves and reviews all detained cases, right? Are you going to move all the other judges into detained court? And there's a lot of these individuals, like I said, going back to they haven't committed any crimes. They were released. They presented themselves at the border, like our laws say, present yourself at the border. They were released. They're being processed. And to detain them and the kids, right? Because kids were also part of that. It's just that, you know, it's unrealistic, but you're putting fear on all these individuals. And can it happen? You know, maybe it can, because there's instructions now that ICE officers have. So now they're empowered to do that. Is there ways we can be like, fight it with a judge? Of course. But again, you just wasted a bunch of resources for an individual that didn't deserve to be detained because he or she had already been processed.
So that gets at another of the issues that I wanted to talk about, was just this issue of like legal versus illegal immigration, right? Mm-hmm. So what you're talking about there is somebody who's trying to go through the proper channels and trying to do it legally. Like, you know, you always hear this pushback. Well, why don't people come here legally? Right. So what are the ways that people can come here legally? And how does the campaign or the media rhetoric on this issue often miss the reality of what you're seeing, you know, with the clients that you're working with and all of that?
I always like doing the history lesson of the different processes. So I'll tee this one up. So the way that you get, like, the way I tell my clients to think about it is the American immigration system is a series of what benefits you can unlock, right? And as U.S. citizens, we don't think about benefits that we have because we have them when we're born. Things like being able to work, things like being able to drive a car legally, things like being able to travel outside the country, maybe getting help from the government if you're, you know, having a tough time, all those types of things. And so as people go through their process, you know, if you have no status, you can't do any of those things, right? And as you go through your process, you might get like a work permit, and then maybe you'll get like a green card later on, which will let you do more of those things and eventually become a US citizen, right? So that's kind of like the process that people want to go through. And the way our system is set up is this. The most number one way people get status is through family, right? Through it being married to a US citizen, or maybe like you get status and then you can file to bring your kids over or something like that. That's probably like 70% of it right there. Then beyond that, there are these other
legal
paths,
legal
right?
immigration.
The legal immigration,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Then beyond that, there are these other paths that are like employment-based visas. There's also things like humanitarian claims, like people have been victims of crime or domestic violence, cooperated with law enforcement, human trafficking victims, things like that. And then there's also like asylum and deportation defense work, like Gabby does, which is going into court and arguing about why people are in danger to go back, having to go back home. And so the system is sort of set up. You can kind of like, if you think about it, it's kind of set up to like for different policy goals, like family unification is important, right? Like our society is better if the family unit is complete, right? That's kind of like, you can see that's how the mindset. And then these labor cases, right? Like it's, we want our economy to be competitive. We want to get the best minds in the world here. And then the humanitarian one, certain people deserve protection. Immigration status can be a part of that for empowering people, right? And then like asylum, kind of a similar thing like that. So that's the broad framework. So the way I'd say it's like all laid out like this at the beginning. And then what happens is they chip away, and each one of those things just gets harder basically year over year as time goes on, because more people want to pass through the system. And so the system is restricted more and more and more in the flow. And then it just creates these like insane backlogs. Like, for example, Gabby, let's say I was your brother. And let's say you were a US citizen and I was a Mexican living in Mexico, and you wanted to bring me to the United States and you filed papers for me today to do that. How long would it take for me to come?
20 years.
More than 20 years, right? And so what that does, when these backlogs, which are a structural problem, you have a pathway available, but it's not actually usable, then that incentivizes people to break the law, right? And so that is the fundamental issue with the system. It's designed in a way that kind of makes sense, but like you look at this Lake and Riley Act stuff going or whatever, it just, the laws that get passed are based on emotional reactions to things. And the people writing them don't even really understand what's in them, but they're supposed to just like send a message about being tough or doing this or doing that. And then all of a sudden it jumbles the system up and makes it less efficient. And then people choose to bypass it more and more over time.
I would like to add something in terms of asylum. People showing up at the border, that is following the law. But we have to remember that as someone that represents a lot of Latin American individuals, a lot of the root causes for people fleeing their home country are gangs and cartels. Who homegrown these gangs? The United States did. And then they deported them all to Latin America. And now you have a bunch of individuals that are terrorized by these gangs coming and fleeing their home country because their government cannot control the gangs there. And so the government or our U.S. laws, asylum laws say, hey, if you fear your country and your government is not protecting you, show up to our border and we will do you a process so that we can see if we can protect you under asylum. And that is what individuals are doing. Again, cartels. Who's the one that's consuming the drugs? It's not Mexico, it is the US. And so again, these are root causes that start in the US and that trickle down to these countries, and where governments aren't able to protect their citizens. So they flee to the United States following the law and showing up at the border requesting asylum, which is again the lawful way to do it. You can't request asylum from Guatemala.
Right. Also, the U.S. oil embargo on Venezuela causing inflation to skyrocket, plummeting the cost of living, and then that forces the underclass out first. And these people come up here, and they're the people with the least education, who are already from the depths of like kind of the bottom part of their own society, and then they get scapegoated, right, as these dirty, dangerous immigrants who are coming in, right? So it's just all this big feedback loop a lot of the time. I mean, it's very complicated, right? But it's unquestionable that it's like a feedback loop in many ways.
Right, but the complexity that you guys are outlining here just totally does not match the conversation that we hear
right
most of the time about immigration. I think, especially from the right, it comes as a way of saying, that people are trying to come here and exploit the system and get giveaways and all of that. When you hear that type of rhetoric and you see the reality in the work that you do, like how do you bridge that conversation? How do you make sense of that in what you're doing on a day-to-day basis?
I think I was telling Kevin this because I was reflecting on this. I think the problem with the US is that we're grown to believe that there is only limited resources and that it's either them or us who gets these resources. And so I think a lot of the time I got to approach it from that way, because just like the divide in Latinos now on immigration, because you have this where you have like, and I don't think the media cover this at all, where you have why are some Latinos or quite a few Latinos against, or secure or voting to secure borders, voting for Trump. And one of the big things we have to realize is that you have these dividing between, like, you have newcomers who are able to, for example, get this work permit because they're applying for asylum. And then you have long immigrants being like, I've been here for a long time. How come I don't have a work permit?
Yeah.
And then you have like, then you have the Republicans being like, yeah, right. They're stealing your resources. You've been here longer. And now the Trump administration, or not the Trump, the Biden administration is just giving out work permits to everybody and giving out state health insurance. And now you have this divide among Latinos on immigration because they're believing this rhetoric. And it really, I think the root of it all is because the United States has made us to believe that there's only a few resources, and only and if it's either them or us to get the resources, but you got to choose. And so now we have this mentality, well, I don't want, I want to close the borders, not give individuals access to their ability to see if they qualify for asylum because they fear persecution, because that means then I'm not going to get something, or they're going to steal my job, or they're going to get public benefits. And that's, I'm not going to get those. So I think that's, a big conversation that I have had in advocating in Latinos and just in general, when people are like afraid of like immigrants. I'm like, look, it's not, there's enough abundance for everyone. There's enough jobs. I bet you don't want to do those jobs. You don't say you do, because then there wouldn't be such a high number of immigrants doing these jobs because no one else wants to. So it's like, we gotta go back and understand that there is enough resources for everyone. And I think the Republicans have done a very good job being this us versus them mentality.
Yeah, they talk about it like it's a zero-sum game, right? And I think Angela and I talked about this in a podcast we did right after the election, and just talking about how some people are out there with just like, well, I'm not getting help from my government, but people who are, crossing the border, these people who are coming here illegally, they're getting help that I'm not getting. And I think that has kind of permeated a lot of these conversations in a lot of ways. And I couldn't agree more. It's just like we have the resources to be able to take care of everybody. It's not like an either or type of situation.
Yeah. If I could add to that also, just like, I've been thinking about it more and more like this. Like, people get mad at undocumented immigrants being in their country because they feel like it's like their house or something, or like whatever, right? Like it's like an invasion. It's like they're violating these rules and my sanctity, my security. But like immigration, it's not that it's like a person who's making a choice to come in, right? It's that there's so many things behind. To be a person who's walking through the freaking desert for 3 days or whatever, there's so much that happens before that is like personal to that person's life, but also these huge economic factors. One of the biggest things that's going to drive migration in the next couple of decades is climate change, and no one's talking about that because it's going to alter like agricultural patterns and stuff, and like tourism and things. And it's going to push poor people to make a calculation about the quality of life versus the risk that they're going to take on this, right? That they can get. And if their quality of life gets low enough and the difference up here is big enough, right, then that's when people start to make that jump. And like, I feel like immigration is one of those things that a lot of social problems get dumped into. I think it's like the education system or the criminal justice system, right? Where it's like, why is there a bad outcome? Why is this? And it's easiest just to point at the end, right? Well, it's like, why is this undocumented guy here, right? It's very easy to give people just to like get mad at the end thing, as opposed to like thinking about the root causes. And it's unfortunate because like the Democrats won't do that either. you know?
Right.
So,
Right. And this is a conversation I have all the time. It's just like, it's so many of the problems that we're seeing in this country are the results of things that are downstream, right? And we're not focusing on addressing the upstream problems that we are dealing with, that average regular people are dealing with downstream. We don't have a ton more time, but I want to get into a couple other things here. I want to talk about, just how this is impacting people on a local level. So there was this story a couple of weeks ago in Milwaukee where the member of the Milwaukee Common Council raised a bunch of concerns about an ICE facility coming into District 9. What exactly happened with all of that, and what is happening next on that issue?
Yeah, so I mean, we do have an ICE facility already. It's downtown on Knapp Street. And so it used to be combined with ICE and USCIS, which is the immigration agency that processes affirmative applications. And so what happened was USCIS now moved down to Wisconsin Avenue. And so ICE is really trying to locate somewhere else and move out of that building. So they're already in Milwaukee. They're on Knapp Street. And so that's what's, so they are choosing that area, and they ask for permits so that they can build a sally port. And so that's where the issue is. But I think, I don't know. I might be someone that I don't know if this is the biggest issue I want to fight for, because I'm just giving you my opinion as an immigration attorney. They were thinking of doing it in the middle of nowhere, Menominee Falls or Waukesha, which is a little more I'm gonna be real racist to our immigrant community. So I don't know if I want them in a more private, more rural area versus in Milwaukee, where I'm closer to them, where there's more immigration attorneys, where we can just drive up there. But that was a whole issue. I definitely am glad, I guess, that you see the Milwaukee community really standing behind the immigrant community and really sending a message to our immigrant community. So that made me happy. But again, we already have an ICE facility. It's on Knapp Street. They're just trying to relocate to a different building.
I think when I talked to some organizers, folks, there was a lot of intersecting, I think, conversations too, given the location, kind of like in the 9th Aldermanic District, largely, Brown Deer-ish type of area, heavily mixed, but also a large Black population as well. And so what does it look like? If you have this facility, this also brings in feds to your backyard. And we know that that's not just going to necessarily be contained to the building itself. And so that, I think, is something that I want to lift up of, why Black residents in that area should also care about that. But then also I think that it's setting the tone locally as well. If people weren't freaked out about Trump's election, people are seeing the action taking place in their own backyards, in their own city. And I think that's dangerous. And I think it's another scare tactic. Something that I think is interesting, the mayor recently sat down and did an interview, and he talked about immigration and kind of answered some questions. And he very much kind of took like we're kind of just wait and see kind of approach. Well, we don't know if anything, we can't stop federal policy. Is that accurate? I mean, I think there's practical, whether you can stop it or not. I think that's important. But I also thought it was a missed opportunity for him to also be firm and actually stand with immigrants. But if you can kind of just clarify, what is the process in Milwaukee? Can it be stopped? And if not, how can we still balance out and say we still don't want this here and we're going to protect our community members?
Yeah.
It's a really interesting, but I don't totally know if I know the answer. I'll just start talking and see if something. So, that is very interesting, because immigration law is obviously federal, right? In terms of, I shouldn't say obviously, immigration law is federal in the sense that the law is the same more or less throughout the entire country. The people who enforce immigration laws are federal employees and not state or local employees, right? They have different bosses, it's a different structure. So there's not they can't pass a law giving people work permits or something like that. You know what I mean? On the local level, that would be cool. On the state level, there is legislative stuff you can do. That's the interaction with some of these federal laws with state laws. The big example would be giving people driver's licenses or whatever, which people had until 2008 or so. And then the legislator took it away, right? On the local level, it's I mean, sanctuary cities, I feel like is a term that is confusing, even to me sometimes as an immigration attorney. So it's like not always clear what is meant by that. But I think there are some law enforcement policies, which I would imagine that the mayor has a hand in terms of like what types of communications are made to ICE when certain individuals come to police attention and things like that. But beyond that, I'm
So
not totally.
the mayor's hands aren't completely tied, I think is what I'm.
I mean, I don't
Even
know.
if it's just, I mean, personally, I would say even his platform too, but it sounds like even if it's just like the way he directs MPD and cooperation and things like that.
Yeah, you have the ability to decide not to cooperate with ICE. Like they can't come after you. I know Trump is going to want to or prosecute any official that doesn't enforce immigration laws. We'll see how that goes. But in the moment, like right now, it's a friendly cooperation. So I think you really need to send a message out if you're really committed to the immigrant community and be like, I am not going to cooperate. If they send me an email saying, hey, we need to access this space, we need to access your resources, we need to access your people, be that no, you are not accessing my people, so you can do something. And so it's that cooperation. How much cooperation are you willing to do with these ICE officers? And if you're not willing to do a lot of cooperation, then send that message out to the immigrant community, because they need to hear that.
So I think
seems like another example quickly of asking for permission versus asking for forgiveness, right? So yeah. Anyway, Angela.
I was going to say, on the flip side, I think one of his arguments that he's making is he doesn't want to be, this is what I interpreted and what I heard, is that he doesn't want to be so bold into, say we're not cooperating because it would inadvertently make Milwaukee actually a bigger target. So he's going to try and kind of scale back and not be so vocal about it. I don't know if that's a question, if y'all want to weigh in on that. I don't think that that's the right analysis, quite frankly. And I think it's, again, kind of preemptively submitting to something instead of actually standing up for your community members. But I thought it was an interesting take, and some would call devil's advocate.
Yeah, I don't really know the political calculations involved. I'll just note that, I mean, Trump accepted the nomination on the stage in our city not too long ago, and now he's doing all this stuff. And it's, I mean, I think at a certain point, it's someone who wants to use power as a club against people. And so there's one or two, you're going to put your hands over your head, you're going to try to do something about it. But
I mean, in either way, ICE officers are going to be doing raids. Either way, ICE officers are going to be in our community. That's their directive. Like, so I don't know if they're really putting a target or not by remaining silent. They're going to have to do it, right? And during the Biden administration, I didn't feel that many raids, like where people were calling me and they like raided a bunch of like 10, 15 people. At the same time, I can't even remember just one time of me having to respond to that. But during the Trump administration, I did have to respond to people that were raided. And so it's like, it's a directive. It's going to happen, right? And so I don't know if staying neutral is really going to protect anyone, but I would say, I think our government officials need to step up. And if you really do care about the immigrant community and you really value what they have offered to Wisconsin, again, let's go back and remind individuals that they were essential workers during COVID-19. Our clients were working 40 hours all the time, putting themselves at risk in these big populations when everyone else was told to stay at their home, and our clients couldn't because their jobs were essential. And so I think at this point, if you really want to say thank you for all that hard work that they did to lift the state of Wisconsin while we were closed during COVID, I think it's a good time for government officials to step up and be like, I support the immigrant community. I will not collaborate with ICE if they ask me. And I'm not going to put our Milwaukee resources or our state resources to help them detain our immigrant community.
That's such a great point.
Yep.
We do have to start wrapping things up here in just a minute, but let's just end on this point here. You mentioned some of the interactions that people might have with ICE. What rights should people know about when interacting with ICE? What are their individual rights?
Yeah, it's a lot of it is challenging because I think a lot of the way that ICE does its enforcement is through like different types of like memorandums they write out and stuff like that, and the rules are changing all of the time. Like they just rescinded something where they can go into hospitals now or something like that. But like, will they actually do it in practice? I don't know.
Churches,
right?
they talked about schools. Yeah.
Right. And part of it too, I think a big message is like the fear, right? So I was looking up the statistics. There was like, 30 people detained at hospitals during Trump's first 4 years, which is not nothing, but it's like you hear it and then everyone's like, oh my God, I can't get medical treatment anymore. Right. So I feel like that's like the fear that this stuff creates. In terms of when individuals have interactions with law enforcement, I mean, you do have some protections based on privacy of your own home and different things like that, right? It's like the door. It's a lot like when a police officer's coming to talk to you. If you have a door between them, you don't want to open. You open the door, they can come in, kind of thing, right? I think that ICE almost never has documents that would compel like a forcible entry to anything. They just kind of show up and they anticipate that people are scared of them, which they are, and then that's how people kind of get arrested. A lot of people would be too afraid to keep the door closed, and like I totally understand that, but that is a right that people do have. Not incriminating yourself is always a good idea with any law enforcement agent, so don't like talk about necessarily like where you're from or what your immigration status is. If a police officer pulls you over and asks you why don't you have a driver's license, you just say I just don't have one, right? So you don't need to go into explanations that can lead to more types of questions and things like that. People do, typically have the right to see a judge and to be able to evaluate their ability to fight a case, leave detention, or stay in the country. So it's very important not to sign anything until you have an attorney, because sometimes they'll put a piece of paper in front of you that will waive the right to do those things. What am I missing, Gabby?
No, I mean, I think you hit them all. The biggest one that you want to engrave in, as an ally to the immigrant community is like, remain silent. Remain silent. Do not say you're undocumented. And I know that in the moment you're afraid and you're like, yeah, I came from like Mexico 20 years ago. I'm sorry. And it's like, no. So it's like, remain silent. If ICE has a warrant to arrest you, they're going to arrest you. You don't need to add to it. A lot of the things with raids is that they will take innocent bystanders if they went looking for someone and that person wasn't home, but they're like, hey, what's your name? Where are you from? And then that person out of fear is like, oh my God, I'm Mexican, I'm undocumented. Like, no, don't say anything, because if they don't have, a lot of the detentions that ICE makes by innocent bystanders are own admissions from the individual. So we got to practice, remain silent. If they have a warrant for you, let them arrest you. But if they don't, then, what if they don't? And then you run the risk that they arrest you because you told them you were undocumented. So I think as allies and that work with the immigrant community, we got to help our immigrant community, remind them that they got to stay quiet.
Don't talk to cops. Always a good rule in my book.
All right. Important stuff, guys. There's so much to this conversation, and perhaps there's another opportunity that we could sit down and talk about this stuff again, because I think it's going to be one of the main issues for this Trump second presidency. And I think instead of what Democrats, I think, have done in a large part, we can't avoid the issue. We got to talk about it. We got to get through these things. We got to figure out where we stand on this and where we are going forward. So Gabriela, Kevin, Angela, thank you so much for having this conversation. Unfortunately, we are out of time for Kevin's terrible takes on sports and pop culture. We'll have to save that one for next time.
I'll be waiting for the invite back. Great to meet you, Angela.
You too.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, guys. So that'll be our